Welcome to the Darkstream, Vox Day, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. We are a little bit early tonight, and this is probably going to be a relatively short one because I am, frankly, rather exhausted. But the audio is good, the video is good, and Restream is working. So we've got this going on DLive as well as unauthorized, unlike last time. However, I do have to say that I thought that the devs did a really good job keeping Owen going while they were having some issues with the other platforms. Unauthorized was always good, but still nice to know that we can get things working with the other platforms. I'm told audio, video good. Also facial hair, also good. Yeah, I'm not growing a beard or anything. I just have been busy the last couple days and haven't really gotten around to shaving and all that sort of thing. So, but it's all good. And we're hoping to get back and hit it hard. In fact, on the bindery front, we got the plate that we needed. We had a special jig constructed for our foil stamping. We weren't comfortable with the way that it's being done by by our predecessors at other binderies. Struck me as a bit too haphazard. I just didn't see any reason for things to be haphazard when we could actually get stuff screwed down permanently in place and hopefully guarantee a perfect stamp every time. So, no, like I said, we're taking our time, we're figuring this stuff out, and we're making sure that we get everything right. So, anyhow, the topic of the stream is Russia unlocks allies. Now, if any of you ever played a Call of Duty, in any of its iterations, you know how a kill streak would unlock new capabilities. And the interesting thing is that's actually in some ways a metaphor for the geopolitical situation and war. How is that? Well, it's pretty simple. When the special military operation started, Russia had to be very cautious. They knew that NATO was backing Ukraine, but they didn't know to what extent. Something that I think a lot of people miss when it comes to trying to figure out what the Russians are doing, why they're doing what they're doing, etc., is that they have to operate in a world of unknowns. And the cost of getting things wrong, the cost of making a major error in judgment can be significant. I mean, look at the way that people argued for months that Russia's operation was a complete failure because they didn't pull off the decapitation strike at Kiev at the very beginning in February 2022. Now, that was a failure, to be sure, but it doesn't mean that the whole operation was a failure. Just as the success of the Pearl Harbor attack, and it was very successful, yes, they didn't destroy the carriers, but they did sink an incredible number of U.S. Navy ships, including a number of battleships. This is a big deal. But that didn't win them the war. The media covering war like a sporting event often leads to false and incorrect conclusions. But it's still true that, you've got limited resources. In history, most of the time, it's your amount of resources that determines the level of success in a war. Not all wars, but most wars are fundamentally attritive. And that's why people often make the mistake of looking primarily at the size of a military rather than the size of a potential military. Any war that lasts more than a year is requiring the replacement of men, the replacement of equipment, additional ammunition, and so forth. And that's where the manufacturing comes in, and that's where the USA of 2023 has nothing whatsoever to do with the USA of 1943. Comparative manufacturing capabilities are very, very different. And in fact, the extent to which China exceeds the US in shipbuilding capability is greater than the extent to which the USA exceeded Japan in shipbuilding capability. And we all know how that ended up. And of course, this doesn't even get into the fact that Japan is still Japan, China is still China, but the USA is only about half American compared to what it was back in the 1940s. The demographics of the state has completely changed. Leif Erikson's correct. He says, production-wise, China is in the position the USA was before World War II, basically. Yeah, although China's in a better position because they already have a sizable military. The USA did not have a very sizable military before World War II. Wehrmacht Bear cites the old aphorism, amateurs discuss tactics, experts discuss logistics. I believe there was, I guess you could say, military historians discuss manufacturing capabilities, industrial capability, and natural resources. The BRICS nations, the Sino-Russian alliance, controls 80% of the world's oil production. Again, this is a change, an inversion of the situation where Japan had no oil and the US had more than it needed. Now the situation has flipped. Europe doesn't have enough oil. The US has enough oil for its needs, but it doesn't have enough for a war against the Sino-Russian alliance. Kontiki is very flattering. It's not correct, but it's gracious of you to say so. He says, plus our greatest living strategist moved to Europe 20 years ago. Well, theoretically, Europe is involved in this war. But, absolutely no one has ever contacted me to say, hey, what do you think? In fact, the only time my views ever got cited in the media was in the hit piece by the Swiss media, where they said, he even says that Russia is going to win the war in Ukraine. Oh my goodness. How crazy is that? It's kind of funny. I have a feeling that after the war is over, they're going to want to disappear that particular piece, just because if I'm correct about that, what else am I correct about, right? Swedish Trash Panda says, I discuss who is lying the most. This is the party most likely to be losing on the ground. Well, yes, but it's hard to say sometimes. Who was lying the most in World War II? I mean, they were all lying like crazy. You know, FDR was guaranteeing that he was going to keep the USA out of World War II while desperately conniving with Churchill trying to figure out how to do it. You know. Is Turkey still a big wild card? I would say it's a wild card, but it's not a particularly big one. Turkey is unstable, and Erdogan is not in perfect control. In fact, he survived a U.S. Supported coup against him about 10 years ago. And so I don't think, I mean, I think Turkey is out for itself. Historically, Russia and Turkey have fought a lot of wars. I think like 8. But they are also significant trading partners with each other. And of course, Russia has never attempted to overthrow the Turkish government like the USA has. So even though Turkey is formally allied with the US, and even though Turkey is formally part of NATO, I don't think that there's any chance that Turkey is going to actually fight against Russia in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, they're not participating in most of the sanctions. Now, the Europeans are, of course, engaging in totally pointless economic charades. Russia doesn't need them. The Europeans are only hurting themselves. It's kind of a toss-up as to which nation's government is the most retarded. When you look at Sweden, when you look at Finland, and when you look at Switzerland. All three countries were neutral. All three countries gave up some degree of their neutrality. I think Finland probably has to take the cake because Switzerland hasn't gone so far that it can't be forgiven, but Finland is right on the Russian border and is permitting U.S. troops and all that sort of thing. I mean, you would think they would know better. I mean, yes, the Finns fought very, very well against the Soviets in the Winter War, but despite how well they did, and despite how poorly the Soviets did, the Finns still ended up with less territory at the end of it all than they had when it started. So, and the Swedes, don't forget, invaded Russia. Charles the Great, King of Sweden, actually invaded Russia. And so you would think that they would want to avoid angering the Russians, but instead they're accepting the U.S. orders and choosing the losing side. And of course, things are now getting more and more complicated because Poland, I think Czechoslovakia, and Hungary are all breaking with the NATO position on the Ukrainian grain. And so it's going to be a mess. Now things are getting a bit more complicated. The U.S. has been desperately looking to open up additional fronts to distract the Russians and to bleed off some of the Russian forces. So it looks like they've had some success in Armenia. It looks like they're not having as much success in Georgia. The Georgians, having tested the Russians back in 2008 and finding that they were put down within 3 days, are not eager to try it again, especially now that the Russians are considerably battle hardened and more prepared for war than they were in 2008. There's a very generous super chat from Nascentis. Recompense for retardery. Appreciate your insights. You are forgiven. Go forth and don't retard. Some folks are amused by that. No, but seriously, there's so much that we can do in our daily lives to improve our performance, to avoid retardery. Many times it's just a simple matter of asking somebody else, hey, does this make sense? I'm thinking about doing this. Does it make sense? And if the person is somebody that you know, somebody that you trust, somebody that you respect, if they say no, maybe listen to them. And if they laugh, don't do what you're going to do. Open, instinctive laughter in response to your intentions is a very big red flag. So unlocking the allies, what are we talking about? Well, it has been reported and rumored that Russia is acquiring 10 million ammunition shells in 122 and 152 millimeter caliber from North Korea. Now, this is really intriguing because Russian ammunition production has actually been much, much greater than expected. Both the use of ammunition and the production of ammunition is significantly greater than the NATO experts had believed. You may recall, about 9 months ago, we were repeatedly told that Russia was 2 weeks from running out of ammunition. That did not happen. And in fact, the Russians have significantly improved their artillery game by incorporating the use of drones and using those to cooperate with their artillery in hunting other artillery. So hunting the Ukrainian artillery. And so it's going to be interesting to think about what do they need that for? Simplicius, who does some excellent work analyzing the situation, he postulates that this is indicative of a coming Russian offensive. And that would make sense. Personally, I think the more significant element is that I think it indicates that China is moving toward open support of the Russian position. The Kim regime is supported and upheld by the Chinese Communist Party. If Kim did not have the support of the Chinese, it's very unlikely that his government would survive for more than a few years. It's very unlikely. In fact, going back to the Korean War, there would not be a North Korea if China hadn't intervened. And so the fact that this reported deal, and apparently Ukrainian sources are saying that the shipments actually began a month and a half ago, and that Russia will be deploying North Korean ammunition and missiles, shells and missiles, by November. And what's really astonishing about this, and we've talked about this before, I've talked about this before, the mainstream has repeatedly refused to incorporate the involvement of Russian allies, despite the fact that they always account for U.S. allies. 2 weeks ago, I said that I would do an extensive analysis of the 24 simulations of China's invasion of Taiwan by a U.S. think tank. I'm about 2/3 of the way through my initial read of the 160 plus page summary. And it's been really fascinating because I have to admit, the simulation designers did a better job than I expected. A better job of designing the overall structure. But unsurprisingly, one of the variables is the involvement of Russian or Chinese allies, but that was not a variable that was really incorporated. Now they know it, so that the designers are well aware of this, but it may not be something that the people who are using the results of the simulations to help formulate policy are really taking into account, because the conclusion is obvious. The conclusion is very clear that Ukraine and NATO can't beat Russia by itself. There's no chance whatsoever if Iran, North Korea, China, etc. came in and got involved to the extent that Europe and the USA has gotten involved in support of Ukraine. Now, the U.S. has been working very hard to try to intimidate the various potential allies and keep them out of it. But it seems that the constant provocations that the U.S. is offering in Taiwan may have pushed China too far. The Chinese are always very, very slow to act. It's laughable when people are talking about how the Chinese want to invade everything and rule the world, and Chung Kuo is being constructed and all this sort of thing. I read Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, and he talks about how he had to repeatedly beg Deng Xiaoping to do something about the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. Now, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, from a Western point of view, was a good thing. They were chasing out the Pol Pot regime, which is one of the most monstrous regimes in history. But the Vietnamese are considered by the other Asians to be the Prussians of Asia. The Vietnamese scare the other Asians the way that Germans have historically scared the people of the West for 2,000 years. Bargain Bear says there's a reason they spent 30 years attacking the U.S. through manufacturing. Yeah, it's asymmetric warfare, unrestricted warfare. 2 Chinese colonels even wrote a book about it in 1999. I highly recommend you read it if you want to have any idea what's going on. Their whole motive was strengthen the position of China while avoiding direct conflict with the U.S. and especially the U.S. military wherever possible. So if China does announce next month, when Putin, after Putin visits there, it's just been announced that Putin will be visiting China next month. It would make sense for China to respond to the U.S. provocations in Taiwan, which include arms sales and some diplomatic visits and all that sort of thing. It would make sense for China to take that first step of open support for the Russian position in Ukraine. China's been implicitly supporting it by refusing to condemn it, but that's all. John says or asks, is the way the Chinese and Russian leadership has played the West indicative of using Sun Tzu, appear weak when you are strong and strong when you are weak? To a certain extent, except for the fact that Russia doesn't have to play it. Russia was weak. Russia didn't know that they were going to be able to not only survive the economic sanctions attack, but thrive until it happened. You can plan out everything you did, but the caution of the Russian approach has made it very clear that they are aware of the negative possibilities. They're aware, they've known. They said from the beginning, I remember it was in February 2022. I was sitting, in the backyard, having drinks with an American guy who is married to Ukrainian, and his Ukrainian wife, and he's very pro-Ukraine, which is understandable. They lived in near Kiev, and he was convinced that this was all about Russia and wanting to take over Ukraine and Putin's ego, all the Financial Times type stuff, right? This is a very smart, very successful guy. And I said, look, it has nothing to do with that. Ukraine is where the war is being fought, but it's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the USA, and to a lesser extent, NATO. Now, obviously, it is a Russian-NATO war. And that's why the Russians need to be so cautious, because they had no idea the extent to which the NATO forces were going to come in. Now, the USA is still being fairly cautious. They've avoided giving Ukraine missiles that are long enough to reach Russia proper. They don't want Ukrainian lunatics firing missiles directly at the Kremlin in Moscow, because they know that means missiles in London and Washington, D.C. But they've obviously given tremendous support, an astonishing amount of support in terms of money and intelligence and satellite information, technical advisors, training, etc., etc., etc. And so when you look at what's happening there, you can see why the Russians had to be cautious, because on their own they are probably strong enough to defeat NATO in their backyard. They're not strong enough to actually defeat NATO per se. Russia cannot invade the USA. It's not possible. It's no more possible for Russia than it was possible for Germany or for Japan. And so that necessarily makes Russia cautious, because they've always been, they're a land power, not a sea power, and land powers don't have the same reach that sea powers do. They never have. And so That's why I think it's significant that they are currently beginning to unlock their allies, because that may signify the expansion of the war, which is World War III. We are in World War III. We're just in the early stages of it. But the fact that they're unlocking the allies means that we appear to be entering the next phase of the war, where it's expanded. Avon B said, Russia stopped Napoleon, Russia stopped Hitler, Russia will stop Clown World. I think that's true, but I think that China is going to help them. And of course, the big X factor is, what does Iran do? If Iran and any of the Arab countries want to go after Israel, the correct time to do so is once both Russia and China are engaged with the United States. I think it's been very interesting that Iran has been as quiet as it's been, but the fact that Armenia appears to be activating on the side of the U.S. could cause Iran to begin to start assuming a more active role. Raging Doomer, is North Korea a more vital ally for the Russians than even a country such as Iran, given North Korea's military might? No. I think Iran is actually pretty strong. And Iran actually has very good drone manufacturing and design capabilities. One of the things that the Ukrainians were protesting was that the Russians were manufacturing. They were first. The Russians denied buying Iranian drones, but Iranian style drones have been seen, and so it's pretty obvious that Iran sold them the designs and Russia's been manufacturing them. Sam says, Armenia made a terrible choice given their historic ties with and protection by Russia. Well, all of the European nations made terrible choices. All of the European nations have repeatedly seen Russia defeat European powers. Repeatedly. Even the invasion of Russia by British, French, and American troops after the October Revolution in support of the White Russians failed. The only people that have ever really been successful attacking Russia are the Huns. And so I suspect that the Armenian decision is because it has a U.S. sponsored political leadership. So it'll be interesting to see how long that leadership stays in place. The neocons are not the only people who can enact regime change. And it will be interesting to see if either Iran or Russia arranges for regime change in Armenia. Which sides do India and Pakistan fall on? India falls very much on Russia's side. Pakistan, I think, is going to stay neutral because Pakistan is close with China. And I think that BRICS is going to be a compelling argument for Pakistan to play nice with India. China also has good relationships with Afghanistan, by the way. And so I believe that the Afghans and the Pakistanis will ultimately follow Chinese direction. at least to the extent of not opposing Russia. So anyhow, I think it's a very significant step. I think it's something that we need to pay close attention to. And I think that it's something that people need to take very seriously in terms of how the world is likely to be affected when the next stage of the war begins. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Dark Stream.